What's going on, everybody? It's Austin, aka More Than an Agent, and today's topic is what happens when a tenant doesn't pay. Like that, listen, it's the first of the month. Some of us have grace periods, right? You're checking your phone, you're waiting on the cash app, waiting on the Zelle to come through. Second day goes by, third day goes by. All right, they'll pay at the they'll pay at the final hour. They don't. You go past the fifth day. Resident still hasn't paid rent. It's now day 10. Tenant still hasn't paid rent. What do you do? Well, the good part about it is that you can follow a protocol. It's no one ever wants to be in this situation. That's why some people choose not to go into real estate. That's why some people choose not to even deal with landlords. This is why they downplay landlording and so on and so forth. Is because what happens if my tenants don't pay? Well, you got a situation in your hand, right? But the reality is there's ways that you can deal with the situation. Because the reality is it won't be your first and it probably won't be your last, unfortunately. But with proper screening, systems, processes, you can limit that as much as possible to put the odds in your favor of attracting good tenants. So let's talk about it. What happens if my tenant doesn't pay? First things first is, I know we like to cry wolf and then all of a sudden like the world's falling down if the tenant hasn't paid by the 5th or by that late day and so on and so forth. But the reality is that this actually happens more often than not, right? So I don't necessarily want you to think the extreme worst, but we will talk about today what happens if you are in that extreme worst case scenario. Like we've been in that scenario where one of our residents owed us up to about $13,000. And luckily we're not in that position anymore. But at one point, that deficit is nothing to sneeze at, right? So we'll talk about all that in a little bit. So first things first, I don't want you to freak out, right? We'll start off on the more benign and we'll get more at a worst case scenario. And in this particular case, don't necessarily freak out. We'll want to find out why, right? So the very first thing is why something could have happened, this particular month. Maybe they found themselves short. Maybe, whatever the case. There's a plethora of reasons why, right? But we want to identify if this is going to be a short-term fixable thing, as in a one-time thing, or if this can turn into and snowball into something bigger, something, much more inconvenient. Did they just have a heavy expense that particular month, or did they lose their job? Two different scenarios, right? So we want to find out why, so that way we can begin assessing, how we need to actually go about it, right? But the biggest thing is trying to keep the line of communication as open as possible, so that way you have the best chances at coming to a resolution, and more importantly, a peaceful resolution as much as possible, because no one wants to be arguing with residents at this particular point in life. I know I personally don't. I don't have time for it. So here we go. Why is tenant late? And in that case, the next thing is proper protocol will have you serve the tenant notice, right? So that way, in the event that you do have the evicted tenant, you have all your ducks in order, you have all your paperwork in a row. But you are going to have to serve the notice to quit. Where in some states, especially here in New Jersey, non-payment of rent, you can immediately file for the eviction. Everything else that is a complaint against the tenant, or the tenant is not doing something in their lease that they're supposed to be doing, you have to serve the notice to quit first. So we'll talk about that right now. I'll put the notice to quit because in theory, that would come before the actual notice to vacate, right? So in this case, non-payment of rent would be immediate grounds to serve the notice to vacate, which if that is going to be something that is going to be detrimental to your investment, right? Nothing personal, strictly business. But if it is going to be something that's going to be detrimental, you are going to have to serve the notice to vacate because you definitely want to stay in control of your investment. However, if it's just something where this is a short-term fix, they just had a heavy expense for that particular month, they've been with you for 4 years, they've never missed a payment before, this is the first time, you'll just serve the notice to quit, just as the official record that, hey, this particular behavior of being late, this is not acceptable, please don't do it again. If you do it again, then we can serve you the notice to vacate, and then if you don't vacate by that time, we serve the eviction, right? So after that will be the eviction. And I know eviction has a terrible tone to it, but please, we'll call it eviction, or we can just frame it differently, and we're going to call it taking back control, right? We're taking back control of our investment. This is our investment. This is our property. We put up the money in order to purchase property. We are in control of the property, not the residents. We are there to serve valuable, affordable, efficient housing and comfortable housing for residents. And in turn, we are paid for our services of providing that, right? But at the same time, in cases where we are losing control, we have to regain control of our investment, regain control of our business, regain control of our family's financial future, ourselves and our family's financial future, right? So these are the steps that you would take in the and obviously each one gets progressively worse and so on and so forth. And we don't want to always have to worry about having to serve evictions, but some things happen and it is what it is. But which is why it's important to have that communication with your resident. And I'm really, really big because I would rather a resident say, hey, listen, this month's rent's going to be a little bit short, but I'll have it, on the 11th, I'll have it on the 15th, so on and so forth, right? When the resident is comfortable with providing that communication, it at least alleviates the stress levels a lot more than you waiting by your phone, anxiously waiting for rent to come in, and then it doesn't show up, right? So this is the process. Another thing that can happen, another thing that you can do, and then we'll jump into the worst case scenarios in the event that they're not paying rent, you can't get them evicted, and they're pretty much freeloading and living off of you for free. We'll talk about that in a second. But another option is, which I don't necessarily like, and I don't like from an accounting standpoint, right? Because in theory, a tenant pays once a month, right? It doesn't necessarily matter when they pay in theory, as long as they pay once a month. Now, obviously, we're setting up our leases where we always want the rent due on the first of the month, right? But accounting-wise, there will always be one payment per month in theory. Now, I've done this before, and again, I don't like to do this because of an accounting standpoint, and when we pay our mortgages, we set up to have our mortgages paid on the 10th of every single month, and that's to allow for the rent to come in and transfers from Cash App to the bank account and so on and so forth, or picking up rent from mailboxes, from our business mailbox, from checks that people that mailed in, and rent comes out. Our mortgages all come out at the 10th, so we usually like to have rent in the accounts by that time to help compensate for that. And what will happen is, if a tenant has maybe missed that first month, the first of the month, that timeline, what I've done is I've also switched them to the 15th of the month. Sorry for the handwriting. But I've also switched them to the 15th of the month. So that way, in theory, my thought process is, and it's worked, don't get me wrong, it's just the fact that in the event, if they miss the 15th, now they're behind, the entire month, right? But I've had it worked out perfectly fine where I switched the individual to the 15th. They just needed a couple more days. They just needed another 2 weeks. They just needed that extra paycheck just to cover that, help cover that for that unexpected big expense. They just needed that extra paycheck. We moved them to the 15th, and then they started paying on the 15th every month, and they got back consistent right? So that's also another option that can happen without necessarily, putting so much emphasis on the first and so on and so forth. Make sure that you are charging your late fees. I know we weren't charging late fees throughout COVID, but now we are nowhere near in shape denying extra money, especially if the resident is going to be late. So these are hopefully, and I say an eviction in your best case scenario, simply because at least if you're able to regain control of the property, then, I mean, that helps, right? But what have all the stories been, especially throughout COVID? We heard of the stories of people not paying rent for years and then not being able to get tenants kicked out and so on and so forth. We had a resident, like I said, we were down 13 grand and we got back current because of what I'll be talking about in a little bit, but we're down 13 grand and she wasn't paying, she wasn't moving, so on and so forth, right? So we were in a pickle because we've now lost a little bit of control from that investment property. Now, luckily, that's 1 out of 3 units, so the other units were able to compensate for it and so on and so forth. But in that particular case, we lost temporary control of our investment for that particular property, right? So what happens if you get through all this and your tenant doesn't want to move, they don't want to pay, right? So we'll dedicate this side to the worst case scenarios. All right. Nobody wants to be in these scenarios. We're not wishing that. We're not saying that all landlords go through this. We're not even saying that this is part of landlording, as, this isn't as common as, somebody that is, just being evicted. Evictions are a lot more common than people that have completely taken over the property and are not choosing to move or anything like that. Mind you, there is a difference between landlord-friendly states and tenant-friendly states. New Jersey, New York, California, the Eastern Coast cities, liberal states, blue states, they tend to be a little bit more tenant-friendly. And red states, the Midwest, down south, tend to be a lot more landlord-friendly. So whatever state you purchase in also dictates how easy or how difficult you will be able to work through your options and work through the solutions, right? So let's put these down here. Okay, so worst case scenarios. And we've been in it, and here are our options if we do find ourselves in those in this particular scenarios. Number one is, and I don't necessarily like this option either, but for desperate times come desperate measures, right? Cash for keys. Cash for keys, in which you and the resident will look to settle on a particular amount. How much money will depend on how much money the resident is looking for and how much money is too much money for you to give up, right? But more importantly, the goal is to regain control of that asset. So important. And unfortunately with real estate, in these particular scenarios, we may have to look at cash for key scenarios in order to regain control of the property, even though we might not feel like, ego-wise, pride-wise, right? Would tell you forget that. I'm not paying their tenant, they owe me. How am I going to pay them to get out of the property I own that they're renting from, that they're just not paying rent for free and then living for free, right? So getting over that pride, swallowing that pride, that ego, it's very, very important, because in theory, reality is if you don't regain control of the property now, you're going to lose a lot more bread. You're going to lose a lot more bread than what you're already down or what you think that you're giving up, right? So gain control, get back control of the property, try to negotiate with the resident, will cash for keys work, and then find out that middle ground where you're able to take control of it, right? If you have, if you've owned the property for 10 years and it's made you a boatload of money over the past 10 years, $5 grand might have to do it, right? 10 grand, I don't want to do it either, but these are the business decisions that you're going to have to make, right? But obviously it's a lot easier when the property has been making you a lot more money than it has been losing you, over time. But again, you do have to take those things into account, right? So I'll give you my what we did, considering the fact that we were in this particular scenario, and this was the absolute worst case scenario that could have happened as far as like resident situation. And in this case, we offered cash for keys. We offered them to try different programs. So we offered them, hey, listen, do you mind going to Section 8? Because at this point, she wound up becoming disabled and could no longer afford the rent. Her kids weren't necessarily the individuals that were, quote unquote, bringing home the bacon, right? So in this case, like I definitely was you know, we definitely were struggling with it, but it's all good. We offered Section 8. She didn't want to do that. Cash for keys, or maybe she didn't qualify for it, or Lord knows if she would have been even able to be accepted with how long the wait list is for Section 8. So that probably wouldn't work anyway, but we offered it. We offered cash for keys. I was prepared to go about, you know, $5,000, $7,500 in order to regain the property. I also probably would have maybe did 10, but I'm glad that we didn't have to. But it was just, you know, what is it going to take for us to regain control of the property, simply because there was no end in sight, and just how New Jersey is with the backlog of just evictions and court dates and so on and so forth. There was no end in sight, so we didn't know how long this was going to play out for. So Section 8 is another thing. Any government or rental assistance, actually I'll just make this rental assistance programs. So any type of rental assistance programs, which this one luckily bailed us out. It's rental assistance programs. So for those that are in New Jersey, the DCA, Department of Consumer Affairs, they had a COVID program that we were able to take advantage of when, you know, for lack of a better word, when shit hit the fan. And luckily they came through. They were not the best agency to deal with. It took a considerable amount of time. We're probably approaching a year since we originally filled out the application, and they just now are looking to cover the arrears, right? So we're going, you know, a whole year and a little bit, almost a year without any rent from one particular resident. So that was hard, but luckily they have finally kicked in, and, you know, so we're good there. And they're going to cover that particular resident for the next 2 years. I'm actually going to consider this as, you know, a Section 8 kind of scenario, you know, short term, in which at least on a monthly basis, I can guarantee that a portion of her rent, pretty much 90% of her rent, 95% of her rent, is going to be covered by the state, right? So rental assistance programs, so on and so forth, landlord assistance programs, which there are not many. And I don't even know if I just spelled that incorrectly, but whatever. Yeah. More than an agent, definitely not the best speller, but it is what it is. Landlord assistance program, so on and so forth. If you found these are a couple of worst case scenarios. If you find yourself in an even worse case scenario where, say, and mind you, each resident, it'll depend on how many units you have, right? If it's one resident and you own a 20-unit building, then, you know, you can hedge your bets a little bit against that and so on and so forth. But if you have a 3-family and one resident or 2 residents have put you in this particular scenario, then, you know, it might be time to either sell, unfortunately, right? Which we don't want to have to, but we might have to sell. Unfortunately, we're going to have to either look to sell at a discount because we got 2 non-paying tenants that we can't get out, and nobody's going to just willingly sign up for that as a buyer, right? So our only options is to either sell, or we are going to have to talk with the bank. We're going to have to talk with our lender. It's an unfortunate situation, but maybe it might have to go into either a deferment or forbearance, not so much forbearance, but if we can defer, if we can buy ourselves a couple of months and tack that onto the back end, you know, that might be an option as well. Maybe we might need a loan modification Maybe we can refinance. We got a lot of equity in the property. Maybe rates are what they need to. I'm not judging it based off of today's rates. I'm judging based off of if and when you find yourself in that particular scenario, where are rates? Can you take advantage of a lower interest rates, or does it still make it feasible where you can refinance, take cash out, and then at the same time buy yourself a couple of months, because when a new loan is initiated, you aren't necessarily responsible for the monthly payment right away. You are able to you are given a couple of months where you don't have to worry about the mortgage payment. So that can help. That can buy time. But these are the more creative ways in the worst case scenarios. I don't want to scare anybody or anything like that, because that's just not the case. But at the same time, if you are in that situation, you're just gonna have to work through the process. It's not the end all be all. COVID obviously messed a lot of things up, just logistic wise. It's not the end of the world. Real estate is still a long-term investment. It's still a long-term cash flowing, cash generating machine. And we don't, I asked one of my mentors or somebody that I look up to who owns a lot of units, what's your thoughts on this? I don't want to sell, but the resident's kind of messing up the numbers here. And he straight up mentioned, each property has two assets to the asset, ironically, right? The first asset is the house itself, right? The house itself. Is it the repairs that's making it difficult? Is it is the structure falling apart? Is the property itself giving you the issue? Or is it the resident, which is the second asset? Is it the residents that are giving the issue? One is easily replaceable, right? Residents in general are easily replaceable. It's hard to have a property that's in the worst side of town or across the street from something that just opened that now is causing a major disruption. It's hard to change that. You can't pick up and move that asset. And obviously it's a lot more expensive to fix a major foundation issue, fix a major plumbing issue, fix, so on and so forth. But residents at least are a lot more interchangeable. Where we'll never want to sell an asset just because of a bad resident, right? Especially a good investment. If the tenant's not paying and it's been giving you problems or repairs, and when you look at your numbers over the course of the years and it's just not performing as an investment, then sure, it might be time to sell. But all of this is to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to maintain control over that property, so that way it can still continue to generate income as it was designed to do when we originally bought it. All right. So what happens if your tenant doesn't pay? Hopefully that answers your question. Be sure to click that link in the bio, whether you're looking to buy the first property, whether you're looking to buy the next investment property, whether you just want to pick my brain, there's a link in there for that. Check that out. And I'm out here. This is Austin, aka More Than an Agent.